The wire-haired terrier had been gone 4 days, when Prudence Greenslade carried him back through the gates of Stallworth Hall, and the whole of the courtyard turned to watch a vicar's penniless daughter walk where she had no right to walk. She held the dog against the front of her grey pelisse, his muddied paws staining the wool she could not afford to ruin, and she did not slow her step for the footmen or the grooms or the lady who came down the wide stone stair with her face already arranged into refusal. Prudence had rehearsed nothing. She had only walked the 3 miles from Dunwillow with the small, warm weight of the animal trembling under her hands, because the collar at his throat carried the crest of the Earl of Tarnwick, and because a creature that whined at her cottage door in the rain was owed a return to its master, whatever the cost to her shoes. She did not yet understand that returning the dog would cost her far more than her shoes. At the top of the stair stood Lady Mordaunt, the Earl's widowed sister, in a morning gown the color of claret, and she looked at the girl in the courtyard the way one looks at a stain on good linen. "I cannot think," she said, to no one and to everyone, "what the parish is coming to, that it sends its beggars up the carriage drive." Prudence stopped at the foot of the stair. The dog lifted his head and gave a small glad cry, and somewhere above them a door opened. The man who came out onto the landing was not young. He moved with the careful economy of a body that had begun to fail him. One hand braced on the balustrade, and when he saw the terrier in the stranger's arms, his composed old face broke open like ice over a river in a thaw. "Tuck," he said, "only that." He came down the steps faster than was wise, and Prudence stepped forward to meet him, and the dog poured himself out of her hands into the Earl's, and pressed his rough head beneath the old man's chin, as though he meant to climb inside his coat. For a long moment, the Earl of Tarnwick said nothing at all. He held the animal and bowed his white head over it, and the courtyard, which had been ready to laugh at the beggar girl, found it had nothing to laugh at. Lady Mordaunt's mouth thinned when her brother lifted his face at last. His eyes were wet, and he looked at Prudence as though she had handed him back something he had given up for dead. "Where did you find him?" he said. "At my door, your lordship." 4 nights passed in the storm. He was caught in the blackthorn along the Dunwillow brook, and his leg was cut. I cleaned it, and I fed him what I had. She paused. I did not know whose he was until the swelling went down and I could read the crest. I would have brought him sooner. "You would have brought him sooner," the Earl repeated, and there was something strange in the way he said it, a kind of wonder, as if simple honesty were a language he had not heard spoken in some time. He looked down at the terrier's bandaged leg, at the neat small stitches of clean linen wound about it, and then at the girl's hands, which were chapped raw at the knuckles and stained at the fingertips with the indigo of the dye-work she took in. "Wallader Indy, cry. You are a needlewoman. I mend lace, your lordship, and I keep the parish register since my father died." "Your father was the vicar at Dunwillow." "He was." The old man was quiet again. The dog licked his jaw, and Lady Mordaunt, who had heard quite enough of this, came down 2 steps and said, in the bright, hard voice of a woman closing a gate, "How fortunate, Edgar, that the creature fell among honest poor. Cook will give the girl a shilling at the kitchen door, and she may be home before dark." She turned her shoulder to Prudence as though the matter were settled, as though the girl were already gone. The Earl of Tarnwick, though, did not let her go. "A shilling," he said softly. "You think I owe this woman a shilling?" He set the dog down at last, and Tuck pressed against his boots, and the Earl looked across the courtyard at Prudence, as if he were seeing behind her tired face, some older face he had loved and failed. "No," he said. "No, I do not think a shilling will answer at all." That was the beginning of it, though. Prudence walked home that evening with nothing but a fed dog behind her, and a strange unease before her, and could not have said why the old man's eyes had followed her to the gate. Dunwillow was a village of perhaps 200 souls, strung along a brook in the shadow of the Tarnwick lands, and Prudence had lived the whole of her 24 years within sight of its church tower. Her father had baptized half the parish and buried the other half, and when the fever took him in the spring, he had left her a cottage with a leaking roof, a Bible, and a name everyone respected, and no one could eat. The living had passed to a stranger. The new vicar's wife wanted the cottage for her own widowed mother, and had said so to Prudence's face, with the gentle ruthlessness of the comfortable. And Prudence had until Michaelmas to find another roof or go upon the parish. She had been a gentleman's daughter once. She was a lace mender now, and the distance between those two facts was the distance she walked every day, and most days she walked it without weeping. She told no one. She had returned the Earl's dog. There seemed no point. Great houses did not remember poor girls, and she did not expect to be remembered. She was wrong about that. On the third morning, a carriage stopped at her gate, which had never in its life held a carriage, and a liveried man came up the path through her cabbages and handed her a letter sealed with the Tarnwick crest. The Earl requested, in a hand grown shaky with age, but firm in its courtesy, the favor of her attendance at the hall on a matter of business. He had sent the carriage. He would not keep her long. And at the bottom, beneath his name, he had added a single line that she read 3 times before she understood it. It concerns your future, and I find I cannot leave it as it stands. She went, because one does not refuse an earl, and because she had no future to speak of and was perhaps a little afraid to learn she did. They received her not in the great drawing-room, but in the library, a long, high chamber, walled to the ceiling with books, where the autumn light fell gold through tall windows and a fire burned though the day was not cold. The Earl sat in a wing chair with Tuck at his feet and a blanket over his knees, and he looked older than he had 3 days before, and frailer, as though the effort of feeling had used him up. It was not the Earl, however, who held Prudence still on the threshold. By the window stood a younger man she did not know, dark-coated and dark-haired, with a face like the front of a house, with all the shutters closed. He did not turn when she entered. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, and his gaze fixed on the lawns below, and a line of his shoulders said, more plainly than speech, that he wished himself anywhere on earth but in that room. "Miss Greenslade," said the Earl. "Thank you for coming. This is my nephew, Mr. Everett Heir. He is my heir." The younger man turned. Then his eyes were a gray, so dark they were nearly the color of slate, and they moved over Prudence once, quickly taking her measure and her mended cuffs and the indigo at her fingers, and then away, as though he had seen all he needed and disliked it. "Uncle," he said, in a voice low and level and without warmth, "I have said I think this a mistake. You have said so. Several times. Sit down, Everett." The Earl turned to Prudence and gestured to the chair across from him, and she sat at the very edge of it with her chapped hands folded in her lap. "Miss Greenslade, I am going to be plain with you, because I have not the time left for delicacy, and because you struck me, 3 days ago, as a woman who would rather hear the truth than be flattered. Was I wrong?" "No, your lordship." "Good." He stroked the dog's head. "I am dying. My physician will not say the word, but I have had this body 60 years, and I know when a thing is ending. I have no children. When I am gone, this estate, the title, the whole of it, passes to that closed door by the window, who will not look at you." A flicker of something almost like humor crossed the old face. "Everett is a good man underneath a great deal of frost. I have watched him become frost over 6 years, and I have done nothing, which is the great cowardice of my old age. I do not propose to die a coward in every particular." Prudence said nothing. She did not understand yet what was being asked, and a cold suspicion was forming that she would not like it when she did. "When I was a young man," the Earl went on, and his voice dropped, and the room seemed to lean toward him, "I loved a woman beneath my station, a steward's daughter. She had hands like yours, raw from work, and a way of telling the truth that frightened my family half to death. My mother had her married off to a tenant in a single fortnight, and I let it happen, because I was 24 and a coward, and I have thought of her every day of my life since. She returned a thing to me once, a thing I had lost, and I gave her nothing for it but my silence." He looked at the dog and then at Prudence, and his eyes were wet again. 3 days ago, a girl with work-worn hands walked up my drive, and put back into my arms the only living creature left on this earth that loves me. And I find that God, or whatever moves these things, has given an old coward one chance to make a different choice than the one he made 40 years ago." "Your lordship," Prudence said, and her voice was not quite steady, "I do not know what you mean to ask of me. I mean to give you a future, Miss Greenslade. I mean to settle upon you a portion sufficient to make you no man's charity. And I mean," he said, "to offer you in marriage to my heir." The fire snapped. By the window, Everett's jaw set like carved stone, and he did not speak, and his silence was the loudest thing in the room. She should have refused at once. Afterward, walking home through the early dark, Prudence told herself 100 times that she should have stood and thanked the dying old man for his kindness, and walked out of his library and out of his life, and gone back to her lace and her leaking roof and her Michaelmas eviction. That would have been the dignified thing. That would have been the safe thing. She had stood, though, at the foot of that stair 3 days before, with nothing in the world but a borrowed dog and a name no one could eat, and the old man had looked at her as though she were worth saving, and no one had looked at her so since her father died. And there was the matter, too, of the closed-shuttered man at the window, who plainly did not want her, and whom the Earl plainly loved, and whom the Earl was trying, in the clumsy, desperate way of the dying, to thaw. So she had not said yes, and she had not said no. She had said, "Mr. Heir does not wish it. I will not be a punishment visited on a man who has done me no wrong." And she had risen and curtsied and gone, and behind her she had heard the Earl say to his nephew, in a tone of dry triumph, "There, you see, she is the only person in this house who has thought of you at all." That sentence walked home with her through the dark, and would not leave her be. It was Lady Mordaunt who came to the cottage the next day, with neither a carriage before her nor a letter to announce her. She arrived on foot, with a maid, 2 paces behind her, and she did not come in, but stood upon the path among the cabbages, as though the very ground might soil her hem, and she looked at Prudence with the still assessing cruelty of a woman who has decided the future and means to defend it. "I will be brief," she said. "My brother is dying, and dying men take fancies, and his fancy this season is you. I have seen it before. A pretty piece of distress, a few humble virtues, and an old man's sentiment does the rest." She drew her gloves tighter. "You will understand that I cannot permit it. My nephew is promised. He has been promised these 2 years to Miss Cecily Drayton, a gentlewoman of family and fortune, and the whole county knows it. Whatever my brother offers you, it is not his to offer. The estate is entailed, Everett is its master in all but name, and Everett will marry where I have arranged he marry. You are a parish charity case, with stained fingers and no settlement. You will refuse him, and you will do it before my brother's notion hardens into a contract. Or, I promise you, child, I will make Dunwillow too small to hold you." She left without waiting for an answer. Prudence stood among her cabbages with her hands stained at the fingertips, and watched the claret-colored figure go down the lane, and the thing she felt was not fear, though there was fear in it, and not anger, though there was anger too. It was recognition. She had been told her whole life what she was permitted to be. She knew the voice, and for the first time, in a long time, standing in the wreck of her father's garden with a great house deciding her fate beyond the brow of the hill, Prudence found that she did not believe the voice at all. The next morning, Everett came to the cottage himself, and that she had not expected. He came on horseback, alone, and he tied his horse to her broken gate and stood in the doorway, filling it too tall for the low cottage, his dark coat beaded with the mist off the brook. Tuck the terrier trotted in at his heel and went at once to the hearth as though he had always lived there, and the small, ordinary loyalty of the dog did more to ease the room than any word the man might have spoken. Everett did not sit. He looked about the bare, clean cottage, at the mended curtains and the swept floor, and the single shelf of her father's books, and something in his closed face shifted by a degree. "My uncle," he said, has set his heart on a thing that will make you wretched. I have come to tell you that you need not consent to it. He is dying, and he is not himself, and when he is gone, I will see you have a portion. Regardless, enough to live, with no condition attached. You need not marry a stranger to be safe." He paused. "I would not have a woman bound to me out of pity for an old man. It is a poor foundation for a life." It was the longest speech she would hear him make for a great while, and there was no warmth in it, but there was something better than warmth. There was care, badly disguised as duty. "Why do you not wish to marry me?" "Mr. Heir," she asked, "is it that I am poor?" "No." The word came fast and hard and seemed to surprise him. He looked away, at the fire, at the dog. "It is that I do not wish to marry at all. I was to be married once 6 years ago. She died of a fever a month before the banns, and the county decided in its wisdom that I had broken her heart and driven her to her grave, because I am not a man who weeps in public, and they mistook my silence for coldness." His jaw worked. "I have let them think it. It was easier than the truth. The truth is that I loved her, past speaking of, and I have not spoken of it since, and I do not intend to lay that weight on another woman who deserves a whole man and not a haunted one." The fire snapped. Outside, the mist thickened on the brook. "Mr. Heir," Prudence said quietly, "I buried my father in the spring, with my own hands at the graveside, because there was no one else, and I have not spoken his name aloud to a living soul since, because grief, I find, is a thing best kept where it cannot be pawed at." She met his dark slate eyes and did not look away. "I do not think you are cold. I think you are careful. There is a great difference, and only a fool mistakes the one for the other." He stared at her for the length of 3 breaths. Then he picked up his hat and called the dog, and the dog would not come. And Everett looked at the terrier curled by her hearth as if betrayed by his only friend. And he went out into the mist alone. At the gate, though, he turned. He gnawed his way out of the kennel and ran 3 miles to a stranger's door in a storm. He said of the dog, "I have never known him do such a thing. I have wondered since what he smelled in you that the rest of us were too proud to." Then he rode away, and Tuck stayed by her fire all that night, and Prudence lay awake listening to him breathe, and understood that something in her life had begun to move that she could not now stop. What followed across the next 3 weeks was a slow and dangerous courtship that neither of them would have called by that name. The Earl, growing frailer, summoned them both to the hall on a dozen small pretexts, and each time arranged that they should be left a quarter hour alone in the library while he dozed or pretended to. And in those quarter hours, with the dog between them and the books rising to the ceiling, Prudence and Everett learned each other the way careful people do, in fragments, around the edges of what they would not say. She found that beneath the frost he was dryly, unexpectedly funny, that he had read every book on the high shelves and remembered them, that he managed the whole vast estate himself, because he did not trust it to stewards and could not bear to see its people ill-used. He found that she saw everything, that she had a memory for figures that shamed his own, that when he spoke of his dead betrothed, she did not flinch from the grief or rush to mend it, but simply sat with him inside it, which no one had done in 6 years. He began to use her given name. The first time he did it, he did not seem to notice he had done it. "Prudence," he said, passing her a book across the hearth. And the word in his low voice landed in her chest like a struck bell, and she carried it home through the dark, and took it out and looked at it 100 times. Lady Mordaunt, however, was not idle, and Lady Mordaunt did not lose. She brought Miss Cecily Drayton to the hall and installed her there, a soft, pretty girl of 22 with golden ringlets and frightened eyes, who had been told her whole life that she was meant for great things and had not the courage to ask whether she wanted them. She arranged that Cecily should be always in the library, always at the pianoforte, always at the Earl's elbow, so that there was no more quarter hour alone. She let it be known in the village, through her maid and the laundress and the wagging tongue of the new vicar's wife, that the parish lace-mender had got above herself, had been seen riding in the Tarnwick carriage, had set her cap at the Heir, and turned an old man's failing wits to her advantage. And on the second Sunday, she contrived that the whole of the congregation should hear her say, in the churchyard after service with Prudence 10 feet off, "One does feel for these poor creatures. They cannot help reaching above their station. It is in the blood, or the lack of it. A gentleman of family, however, does not actually marry the woman who returns his dog. He rewards her, and he sends her home." She smiled at Prudence across the gravestones. "Do go home, my dear. It is kinder in the end to all of us." That was the second voicing of the thing, and it was meant to be public, and it landed as it was meant to. Prudence stood among the graves with the whole parish watching her cheeks burn, and she did not answer, and her silence was taken for shame. Worse came. Lady Mordaunt produced a letter. She produced it at dinner, before the Earl and Everett and Cecily and 3 witnesses from the neighboring families, drawing it from her reticule with the air of a woman performing a sad duty. It was, she said, a letter in Everett's own hand, written 2 years past, expressing a settled understanding with Miss Drayton, a private promise that any man of honor must hold himself bound by. She read aloud a sentence from it. The hand was very like Everett's. The sentence spoke of affection and expectation and a future, understood between 2 families. And around the table the witnesses murmured, and Cecily went white and stared at her plate, and the Earl set down his glass with a hand that shook, and Everett looked at the letter his aunt held aloft and said, in a voice gone perfectly flat, "I did not write that." "Of course you would say so," said Lady Mordaunt gently. "Now that it is inconvenient, I did not write it," he said again. "And you know I did not, because you know my hand, and you know I never in my life signed myself in that fashion." But the witnesses had heard the sentence, and the sentence had been sweet. And a letter once read aloud cannot be unread. The doubt was sown. The county had its story now, and the story was that the Heir of Tarnwick had been privately promised to a gentlewoman and was being lured from his honor by a scheming pauper, and that the dying Earl was too sentimental to see it. By morning, it was in every drawing-room within 10 miles. By evening it had reached Dunwillow, and the new vicar's wife told Prudence to her face that she had brought shame on her father's memory, and that the cottage must be vacated within the week, sentiment being a luxury the parish could no longer extend to a girl of her sort. Prudence walked out to the Tarnwick brook that night, to the place where the blackthorn grew, where the dog had been caught, and she stood in the cold and let herself, for the first time, believe that she had lost. She had no proof. The letter was false. She had no money, no family, no roof past the week's end. She had a name that bought no bread, and a future the great house had given her, and the great house was now taking back. She thought of going. There was a coach to the north on Thursday, and a former servant of her father's in a northern town who might find her a place. She could disappear into service and never again walk up a carriage drive in a stained pelisse. It would be the safe thing. It would be the dignified thing. She stood by the black water a long time. And then she remembered the letter, and the way Everett had said, "I never in my life signed myself in that fashion," and she remembered something she had seen and not understood, 3 weeks before, on her very first visit to the library, when the Earl had handed her a book and she had glimpsed inside its cover his bookplate, and beneath it a name written in a young man's hand, and the way that young man closed his loops. Everett kept the estate's accounts himself. Everett's hand was all over the Tarnwick ledgers, the rent books, the parish charity records, that, as the vicar's daughter who still kept the register, Prudence had every right to consult. If the letter was forged, then whoever had forged it had studied his hand. And a forger, however careful, betrays himself in the small, habitual things a man does without thought, the way he crosses a T, the way he closes a G. Prudence was a needlewoman. She had spent 10 years bent over lace, and her whole art was the art of seeing the one false stitch among 10,000 true ones. She went home and she did not pack for the northern coach. She lit her candle, and she sat down, and she began to think about loops, "That's—" The dog scratched at her door near midnight, having gnawed out of the hall kennel a second time, and she let him in, and he settled at her feet, as though he had appointed himself to the work, and together they sat up until the candle guttered. In the morning she went to the Tarnwick steward's office where the parish charity ledgers were kept, and she asked, as was her right, to see the records of her father's old disbursements. And while the clerk fetched them, she let her eye travel the shelves until she found what she had come for. 3 years of estate correspondence in Everett's unmistakable hand. Letter after letter to tenants and tradesmen and bankers. Hundreds of examples of the way the man actually formed his words when he was not being watched. She asked to copy a passage concerning her father's charity, which was true. The clerk left her to it, and Prudence sat with the real letters under her hand, and held in her memory the forged sentence Lady Mordaunt had read aloud, and she looked, as only a lace-mender looks, for the false stitch. She found it in the word future. Everett, in 3 years of correspondence, never once closed the long descending stroke of his lowercase letters with a leftward hook. He drove them straight down and lifted clean a plain, economical hand with no flourish in it anywhere, the hand of a man who wrote a great deal and wasted no motion. The forged letter sentence, the sweet sentence about a future understood between two families, the one phrase Lady Mordaunt had read aloud and the witnesses remembered, had a small curl at the foot of its descenders, a leftward hook, a decorative habit. It was a beautiful imitation. It had got the slant and the spacing and the very pressure of the pen. It had been written, though, by a hand that could not help being graceful, a hand trained to ornament, a woman's accomplished hand, and Everett's hand was not graceful, and never had been. Prudence knew that hand. She had watched it for 3 weeks at the pianoforte and the writing desk. It was Cecily Drayton's. She sat very still in the steward's office with the truth in front of her, and she understood 3 things at once. The forgery was real, and she could prove it. Cecily had written it. Almost certainly, at Lady Mordaunt's command, almost certainly weeping. And the proving of it would ruin a frightened girl of 22 who had been bent to it by an aunt's iron will, and who had stared at her plate that night at dinner, because she could not bear to look at what she had done. A lesser woman would have rejoiced. Prudence did not rejoice. She copied her father's charity record, as she had said she would, and she thanked the clerk, and she walked home, and she thought the whole way, not about her vindication, but about the white face of a girl who had been told her entire life that she was the correct choice and had never once been asked what she wanted. The Tarnwick Harvest Assembly was held that Saturday in the long gallery of the hall, as it had been held every Michaelmas for 100 years, and the whole county came to it, and Lady Mordaunt had arranged the evening as a coronation. Cecily Drayton, in white and gold, was placed near the Earl. The forged letter, its work done, had become common knowledge. The marriage of the heir to Miss Drayton was spoken of as a settled thing, only awaiting the old man's death to be made formal. And Prudence had not been invited, which was the whole point, that the parish should see her absent and understand her sent home. She came anyway. She came on foot in her grey pelisse, with her father's small Bible in her reticule and the dog at her heel, because Tuck would not be left, and she walked into the long, bright gallery, full of the county's silk and candlelight, and the music faltered, and 200 faces turned. And Lady Mordaunt rose from her chair with her color high and her voice pitched to carry to every corner of the room. "You were not asked here," she said. "I think everyone present understands why. This is the 3rd time, child, that I have had to say a thing to you that a person of any delicacy would have understood unsaid. You are not wanted. You are not suitable. You are a poor man's daughter, who returned a dog and mistook a reward for a romance, and you have shamed yourself, and you have shamed the memory of your father, who is at least a gentleman, by clinging where you are not wanted. Now go home." It was the 3rd voicing, and it was the cruelest, and it was delivered in the great arena where the whole county could witness it. And Lady Mordaunt meant it to be the end of the story. Prudence stood in the doorway with the dog against her ankle, and let the silence stretch. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but the gallery had gone so still that it reached the farthest candle. "You read a letter aloud at your brother's table," she said. "A letter, you say," Mr. Sayer wrote. "I have come to return something, my lady, as is apparently my habit in this house. I have come to return that letter to its author." She drew from her reticule not the Bible but a single folded sheet, her own copy, made in the steward's office, of one of Everett's true letters set beside the traced words of the forged sentence. "Mr. Sayer writes a plain hand. He drives his strokes straight down and lifts clean. He has done so in 300 letters in your own steward's room, which any person here may go and see tonight. The letter you read drew its descenders with a curl at the foot, a graceful hook, the habit of a hand trained to ornament. Mr. Sayer's hand has no ornament in it anywhere." She lifted her eyes, not to Lady Mordaunt, but to the white-faced girl in white and gold, beside the Earl's chair. "There is one accomplished hand in this room that closes its letters with just such a curl. I have watched it at the pianoforte and the writing desk for 3 weeks. I will not name it aloud, because the hand that wrote that letter did not want to write it, and wept while it wrote, and has been wretched ever since. I will say this much, my lady. You read that letter as proof of Mr. Sayer's dishonor. It is proof of someone's. It is not his." The gallery did not erupt. That was not the way of these people. It did something quieter and far more terrible to Lady Mordaunt. It began 200 faces at once. To do arithmetic, to remember whose accomplishments included a fine Italian hand, to recall how the letter had appeared, and who had produced it, and who stood to gain. Well, and Cecily Drayton, who had borne the weight of her aunt's certainty her whole life, and the weight of this forgery for a fortnight, put her face in her 2 gloved hands and began silently to weep, which was a confession louder than any word. Lady Mordaunt's mouth opened and produced nothing. For the first time in the whole long autumn, the woman in claret had no sentence ready. She looked at her weeping protégé, and at the arithmetic moving across 200 faces, and at her dying brother, who had risen trembling from his chair, and she fragmented, at last, into a single broken phrase. "I did it for the family," she said. "I did it for the family. The estate, the name, it must be kept in the blood." But no one was listening to her any longer, because Everett had crossed the room. He crossed it slowly, through the parting crowd, past his aunt, past the weeping girl. And he came to the doorway where Prudence stood with the dog at her ankle, and he stopped before her, in the full sight of the county, that had named him a heartless man for 6 years. The candlelight stood still. The dog looked up between them. And Everett Sayer, who did not weep in public and never had, took Prudence Greenslade's raw-chapped hand in both of his, and bowed his dark head, and pressed it for a moment to his lips, and then he straightened and turned so that his words reached the farthest candle. "This is the woman I will marry," he said. 6 words. He spoke them in the same long gallery where the county had rendered its verdict on him, and on her, and he did not make a speech, and he did not strike at his aunt, and he did not match her cruelty with his own. He claimed a name, and he claimed it once, and it was enough. The Earl of Tarnwick, on his feet by his chair, with one hand pressed to his chest and the other gripping its arm, began, weakly, to laugh. A wet, broken laugh that was half a sob. The laugh of a man who has watched, at the very end of his life, a different choice made than the one he made 40 years ago. "There," he said, "to no one, to everyone, to the woman he had loved and failed when he was 24. There, you see, it can be done." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church at Dunwillow where Prudence's father had stood at the altar for 30 years, and the new vicar read the service with a face that had learned, very recently, a new respect. The Earl of Tarnwick was carried to the church in a chair, too weak to walk, and he saw them wed, and he held on until he had seen it, and he died 11 days after, quietly, in the library, with the dog on the foot of his bed, and a settlement in his desk that made Prudence mistress of more than her own roof. For the old man had not, in the end, merely married her to his heir. He had restored to her, by the terms of his will, the small freehold farm of Larkinshaw at the edge of the Tarnwick lands, which had been her mother's family's once, 2 generations back, before debt and bad seasons carried it off and scattered the Greenslades into the parish poor. The Earl had bought it quietly that very autumn, the moment he learned her name. "It concerns your future," he had written her, "and I find I cannot leave it, as it stands." He had meant it more completely than she had understood. He had given her back not only a husband and a portion, but the ground her own people had walked, so that she came to her marriage, not as a charity, but as a woman with land of her own under her feet. Lady Mordaunt was not destroyed. Everett would not have it, and Prudence would not have it, and the dead Earl's will had already settled the matter with a mercy his sister had not earned. She kept her widow's jointure and her rooms in the dower house at the far end of the park, and she lived, and she was received, after a fashion, by those who could not afford to cut a connection of Tarnwick. The county, however, had done its arithmetic, and did not forget the answer, and the woman who had spent her life arranging other lives found that no one any longer asked her to arrange anything, and that for such a woman was correction enough. She and her brother's heir were civil when they met. They did not pretend to be more. As for Cecily Drayton, Prudence did a thing the county thought strange, and the county slowly came to understand, and she befriended the girl who had forged the letter against her. For she had seen, that night in the gallery, that the frightened creature in white and gold was only herself in a different gown. A woman told her whole life what she was permitted to be. Cecily married, within the year, a kind plain clergyman of her own choosing in a parish of her own choosing, and wrote to Prudence, in her fine accomplished hand with its graceful hooks, that she had not known a person could simply decide to want a different life, and that she was grateful past speaking of it to have been shown. If Prudence's quiet courage moved you, stay a moment at the end of her story, for the end of it is the best part, and tell another soul tonight the worth of a person the world has not bothered to see. They lived at Larkinshaw, not at the Great Hall, though Everett was its master now, and rode there daily to its business. For Prudence would not be parted from the small farmhouse with the low ceilings and the brook at the foot of the garden, and Everett, who had spent 6 years in a great cold house, being mistaken for a cold man, found that he preferred the low rooms and the firelight, and the woman who saw everything, and the dog who had started it all. They restored the farm together through that first long winter, the byre and the orchard and the kitchen garden where her father's people had grown their cabbages 100 years before, and the frost went out of Everett by inches, the way frost goes out of the ground in spring, from the bottom up and all at once, and too gradual to mark, until one morning it is simply gone. He laughed. By Christmas. Not often, and never loudly, but Prudence learned the rare dry sound of it and treasured each one, as the Earl had taught her to, as a significant event. He spoke of his dead betrothed sometimes by the fire, and was not ashamed, because his wife sat with him inside the grief, and did not paw at it, and a sorrow shared inside a warm room is a different creature from a sorrow carried alone through a cold one. He told her once that he had loved her on the morning he came to the cottage, and she had said there is a great difference between cold and careful, because no one in 6 years had troubled to make the distinction, and he had ridden home and known himself, seen, and been frightened half to death by it. She kept her father's small Bible on the shelf with his name written young in the front cover. She kept the parish register still, out of love for the work and the dead man who had taught it to her. And on the worn stone doorstep of Larkinshaw, where the brook ran cold past the foot of the garden and the bare autumn trees gave way each year to spring, a wire-haired terrier named Tuck lay in the last of the afternoon sun with his chin upon his paws, grown gray about the muzzle now. The small loyal creature who had gnawed his way out of a kennel in a storm and run 3 miles to a stranger's door, and so all unknowing returned to one penniless woman every single thing the world had decided she would never have.